So this next session is a chance for you to talk to them, to get their ideas on things, to ask questions. So I will get out of the way and welcome the members of the Rails core team that are here. They are, I'll start with the one that's sitting down so he has to get up, Jeremy Kemper. Rick Olson. Michael Koziarski. Yehuda Katz. And David Heinemeier Hansson. Am I on? You may now ask questions. There are mics in the middle of the room, as there were last night. So no questions without the mic, or we will ignore you. Yeah. Can we change the lights now, Johnny?
Hello. Are you guys letting Yehuda turn Rails into Drupal?
The answer is yes.
I think that the whole idea of the mountable, reusable applications is something that we don't necessarily all think will ship anytime really soon. But I think in the past, myself especially, we've probably been quite quick to say, that's a fucking stupid idea, don't even bother. So I think it's actually really positive that there's someone who's willing to give it a go, and hey, if it works out, then that's great. If it doesn't, then at least we know we tried, right? It'll never be PHP, at least.
I would also, of course, say that if you were at my talk, the point is to not put it into Rails, right? The point is to make Rails better at enabling that sort of thing outside of the Rails core.
I've had a philosophical concern with putting this kind of thing, making it available in Rails, because often if you go to the Ruby on Rails IRC chat room, people are showing up for the first time, and the first thing they're looking for is how to do authentication, looking for a plugin, which Rick has helped with over the years. But it becomes the pathway that you look for a part that you can just plug together. And the concern is that we get into this, what Matt Aminetti called the Duplo generation, where you're looking for big building blocks and expect to just be able to stick them together. So it doesn't mean that everybody's going to do that, but the concern is that it makes that the obvious pathway.
That was quick. All right.
One of the things I've been struggling with is how much JavaScript to use in my applications. And every time I start to go there, I'm walking away from Ruby, which I enjoy as a language, into something that I don't enjoy. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on using more and more JavaScript in Rails applications.
Well, I take the same position as I do on SQL. Active Record embraces SQL rather than trying to abstract it all away. You should use the tools that are native to the environment you're working in rather than trying to wrap them up and pretend that they aren't there. So if you're doing a JavaScript-heavy application, learn JavaScript and learn to love it.
Yeah, JavaScript is not a bad language.
Yeah, I think I definitely changed my position on JavaScript over the years, just from the libraries that have emerged. The first Ajax applications we were all writing without Prototype or jQuery or other libraries like that. I thought that was like pulling teeth. I did not want to deal with that. But JavaScript of 4 or 5 years ago is not the same JavaScript of today. The wrap-ups of Prototype and jQuery has just made it a whole lot less painful. So I've sort of changed my position on that, and I think anybody who has just that animosity against JavaScript from working with this stuff in earlier years really needs to revisit just what the state of the art is, and and the state of the art is pretty damn good.
Right, imagine if you were writing a Ruby application and didn't have Rails. You would probably find that pretty painful. So I think similarly, a lot of people have had the perspective of having tried to do JavaScript before the libraries were fully baked, but now they're actually pretty awesome. And I know a lot of people who have taken a second look and have really come to like it. I obviously work on JavaScript frameworks, so I'm biased, but there's definitely something to be said for learning to enjoy JavaScript as a language. It's actually a pretty high-level language, has lambdas and stuff. It's not like assembler.
Yeah, and as Jeremy was saying, I don't think it. If you're building web applications that use JavaScript, you need to know. I mean, you can't just abstract all of this away. Just like not knowing any SQL is not a great way to use Active Record. Just because we're making things easier and there are abstractions up top of it, they're always going to leak in one way or another. So if you're using something that's wrapped up, if you're using helpers or RJS or any of these other things that provide an abstraction level above JavaScript, that's no excuse not to have a good understanding of what's going on. Because these things, there will be errors, there will be failures, and you have no clue what's going on if you don't know what's going on underneath.
So from your keynote, one of the goals of Rails 3 is unobtrusive JavaScript. And there's sort of two facets of unobtrusive JavaScript. There's pulling it out of the HTML code, but there's also degrading gracefully. And the example you gave of the delete link, even though it's pulling it out of the HTML script, it still doesn't degrade gracefully because obviously if JavaScript is disabled, that's just going to visit the resource instead of deleting it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the right answer for degrading gracefully with delete links is to have a link that goes to a get link that goes to a confirmation page, which has a button. Now, it should be up to you to decide whether or not you actually want to implement that, right? If you actually don't need no JavaScript, then having a link that all happens is JavaScript does that work for you, that's fine. But it is I would hope that the JavaScript helpers that we're going to write will easily enable the unobtrusive way of if you want to implement a separate page that in the non-JavaScript way lets you click on a button for delete, I would think that would work.
And I'd also say that that's one of the things was harder to just abstract and make generic. I mean, we're getting sort of the delete helper pattern is something we can make generic. We can't necessarily make generic what your confirmation screen is going to be or how your action is going to reroute that. So the definition just requires that you're going to have to do some manual work to make that part of it work. And for a lot of people, it just doesn't matter. I mean, at 37 Signals, we take the position that if you're not using JavaScript, you can't use our apps because it's not worth for us to do that. That is certainly not true for all apps. It just means that we're not willing to put in the work to make it degrade gracefully.
Right, and that tends to be something that I push back on with clients or consulting work that I do. I mean, I say this as a no-script user, so JavaScript is often enough for me, and people's sites often look kind of useless until I do the whole right-click enable JavaScript kind of dance. But this is a tiny percentage of users who do this, and historically people would say the reason that we have to support no JavaScript is to allow screen readers and all that kind of stuff to work correctly. They actually do a pretty good job now, and I don't think there's any reasonable market share that's using sort of W3M or links or something on Unix in order to browse your website, and if they are, odds are they're probably not going to pay you to browse their website, and they're not going to see any of your ads, so maybe you don't need to spend a whole lot of time worrying about them.
Hi. Recently there was a patch submitted that changed the sort of subclassing of has one through, and it was just a straight refactoring. It didn't add any features, and it didn't fix any bugs. And that particular patch was rejected, I think, based on the fact that it didn't fix bugs or features, but I think there was a sort of general consensus among the people that saw it that it was, a potentially worthy patch. I was wondering what your feelings are generally about people who take the time to just clean up code without any particular story behind it.
Well, I think that's great. I really appreciate the effort people put into something, especially sticking with a patch, because it does, even now in the Git era when you can fork and just apply it yourself and prove to others that it's a great idea, it still can take a bit of work to get it into master. So even if you're not fixing a bug, if it's just code cleanup, even if you want to remove white space, I don't care. If it's something that matters to you, you should patch it and advocate for it, and it doesn't make it any less important.
I think his question was that they did that and there was a consensus that the patch should be rejected.
Yeah, well, I disagree. I don't think it should have been rejected.
I think it's a very delicate balancing act. I'm all in favor of refactoring. We have a large test suite. How effective it is a matter for debate. But the reality is every time we'll apply a patch like that, we're going to break something that someone's doing with some crazy plugin. Now, in that particular case, I didn't really see the patch, so I don't really know. But we've always got to weigh it up. It's not as simple and straightforward a case as when you've just got 6 developers using a particular application. You know, I can change how this API works, or I can change the implementation of this and know that there's going to be no negative consequences. So I tend to err on the side of not taking patches which are just refactoring, but I'm also fine if there's some kind of, I want to do this refactoring so that in a couple of weeks I'll be able to make the following kind of changes. And I think that would probably be fine in that case. But if it is just to change things, it would have to be a pretty awesome refactoring in order to get my attention.
Right. I would also say if you refactor code, if you include like a shim, like, okay, so there's no longer a has-one association class, but here's a compatibility code, has-one association equals whatever. I think that would probably help.
I think, well, one other aspect I think is sticking with it and advocating for it and not taking your marbles and going home if there's a rejection, because really nothing is final. You can keep arguing for something and make a little stink about it, and that's okay. Mention it on Twitter, get other people to care, and just get people paying attention to it. It's worthwhile.
I think one other thing that I notice is that it's easy to forget that the people who are going to be reviewing your patches are just human beings. They're likely to make mistakes, and they're likely to respond like a human being will. So if I close a patch and say, no, I don't really see what's up with, I don't really see the benefit, sorry, thanks for taking the time. If you comment back and say, oh, well, have you thought about this aspect or that aspect, that's much more likely to get it reopened than going, God, Koz, you're such a douche. And that is unfortunately quite a common thing. And it's that same thing about taking your marbles and going home. Whenever I reject something, which is thankfully not really that often, it's not because don't take it as a final discussion, but also don't take it personally, because I'm often wrong.
So I've heard you guys say that you wanted to get some alpha code released by RailsConf, and that didn't happen. And my next thought then is I look up and see the 5 of you. Obviously, there are more people working on Rails than just you, but I look at us, and there are a lot more people using Rails than just us. There are way more of us than you. So as a community member...
We're surrounded.
Is this a threat?
Oh, shit.
We're going to destroy you. So as a community member, what do you want help with from us for Rails 3? My first thought would be, maybe you want us to clone master and start playing with active ORM and seeing if it works. But for all I know, I'm wrong. Maybe you want us to go document these methods. What do you want us to be doing?
I think we had a discussion recently actually about what state master should be in. And I think this is a great question, because I believe that master should always be in a usable state. We shouldn't ever work for a suspended period of time on something that's in flux. If what's in flux is because it's not done yet, it doesn't really, in my mind, belong on master, because we want people to be testing this stuff as early as possible. My own approach to developing with Rails is whenever I start something new, I start it off master. So master has to have some baseline of just working most of the time. Not all features have to be complete. There can still be work that's required to be done. It's not in a release quality in that sense, but it needs to work well enough that you would base an app on it. So I absolutely think that people should be trying out master, they should be working with master, and they should be complaining loudly when master is breaking in various ways. Because one of the problems we've had sort of in the past have been, if there's not enough new people coming in and using master, things can be left broken for too long. The longer you leave something broken, the less likely it is that it's going to be fixed quickly. We had a lot of issues around the reloading stuff we did for a while, where master was in perhaps a month or even more than that, was in a state that wasn't really terribly usable. And that's not going to fly.
At the same time, one of the challenges we have is if we keep master too usable. Everyone who's willing to do any kind of beta testing is just running off edge rails, and so that process of upgrading a running application just doesn't get tested, because if you install master and you notice that there's something that's missing and there's a deprecation that's forgotten, you'll just go, oh, okay, and change it yourself and not think that it's a big deal. They'll obviously get back to that. But that means that when we actually ship our first RC or the final point releases that we do, there's often some really, really simple stuff that's just completely broken because that upgrade action hasn't been tested. So I personally try to run on the most recent stable branch, and I'm hoping to do a few more stable releases out of that. And I think one of the great things to do if you want to help out with the Rails 3 effort would be to periodically test that upgrade. So take your app which is running in 2.3, create a branch for it, move it to master, and just see what breaks. And just mention it in IRC, on the core mailing list somewhere. Chances are we'll just say, oh, okay, yeah, we'll get to that, but there's still a good chance that we'll have forgotten about it, and everyone's life will be better in that regard.
I think getting your apps running on master and keeping them running on master is a great first step. And for all the plugin authors out there, getting familiar with the changes that are going into Action Pack right now, and rethinking the way that your plugin works in terms of kind of the new era, the new world, both with Action Pack and with Rack, so that your plugins are there and ready to go for everybody else with their apps trying to upgrade using your stuff. You're the ones who will make it easy for everybody else to keep up with the future.
Yeah, definitely. It happens too often that Rails releases a point release and then all the plugin authors scramble to fix their plugins. More important than even users getting on Edge Rails is plugin developers making sure that when we press the button and actually release RCs or finals, your plugin already works. So.
Actually, I'd like to get one little pitch in here, too, for the Google Summer of Code. We have 4 students working this summer on Rails 3 kind of core concerns. And anything you guys could do to follow along and advocate for them and help them out, just be aware of what they're up to. Their projects are going to be starting in late May, I believe. So just follow along and give them support. It would really help.
I have a really important question. Is Rails 3 finally going to be enterprise ready? I'll take my answer off the air.
I guess no.
Well, I think Rails 2 has already proven to be enterprise ready. So.
Yeah, I think there are some specific. That's a touchy question, of course, but there are things that we can actually do to make enterprises like Rails more, and really touchy. But I think ORM agnosticism will actually help some. There's always a question of how much we want people to be taking a weird middle path, but if someone has a huge amount of Hibernate stuff, I totally imagine an ORM agnostic Hibernate weird JRuby thing, and I would never use that. That seems crazy, but I bet you that a lot of enterprise people will find that appealing. And so making Rails itself more open to different things that are not necessarily the golden path of Rails, not for us necessarily, but for people who have those other weird things, I think will help. But I think, as others have pointed out, a lot of enterprises use Rails 2, so it's not as though Rails 2 is not usable.
Hey, one of the things that I really got out of David's keynote was that you guys don't all know what's going on in the code at the same time. You're not superheroes, right? And it's really refreshing to see you guys in the halls, debating how should we implement this? Oh, is this how this works? And so I'd like to maybe gain a little more insight about what's going on currently. If maybe each of you could talk about what you're currently working on, and maybe if there was a debate in the past week or two about how to implement it, it'd be great to hear about it.
Well, the last thing I've been working on is splitting up active support. It has this kind of taint on it where people think that it's really heavyweight, this very quotable word. So breaking apart what it means to be heavyweight, what it means to rely on something like a support library, because that's what it is. It's meant to be shared. And so approaching that psychological problem of shareability, being able to require active support is now extremely cheap. And you can cherry pick just the little bits that you want. So any library can say, well, I only need the inflector. I just get the inflector. You don't get all the core extensions for everything else, which pulls in about half of the Ruby standard library.
The main thing that I've been working on is implementing pluggable JSON backends. One of the big problems with people using the JSON gem is that it's a lot faster than the active support JSON parsing, but it overrides the toJSON method, and it wreaks havoc in your Rails app. So I implemented a pluggable backend so you could use that or other JSON parsers. I haven't actually started writing code, but I've been thinking a lot about active resource and possibly swapping out the connection backend with a REST client or something like that. Is this too loud? Okay. I guess that's about it for me.
I've just come back from a really long holiday, so I haven't done much lately, which has been nice, to be honest. What I'm currently working on, the sort of big ticket item, is the cross-site scripting support. So I don't know how many of you missed it, but there was that nasty Twitter worm that went around. So we spoke with them about what it was that was broken in their application and discussed a bunch about what the potential solutions would be. And so what we've come up with, we're reasonably confident on. And now I sort of get to shave a yak by going through and making it actually work in all the different corner cases. For that, I'm hoping to release it as a plugin for 2.3 so that you'll be able to get that protection today and then have it on by default in 3.0. In order to enable that, I'm actually building it on the 2.3 code base and then looking to forward port it to 3.0. Additionally, we just applied, I think Jeremy actually did it, but it was Murray's patch to do inverse associations in active records. So if you go user.posts and then on those posts object you get the user, you'll actually get the same instance back now, which is a huge win for a lot of situations, but doesn't come with some of the complexities that an identity map does, and I'm happy to discuss that. Well, I'm not actually. I have to run to the airport immediately after this, but I'm happy to email with people about what those complexities are. But given the feature set that we have with active record, it's not as simple as just object find or retrieve it from this hash. So hopefully we can get sort of 90% of the benefits that people want, such as not wasting gigs and gigs of RAM when you're iterating over a collection, but keep the active record interface really nice and simple.
Yeah, I've been working on refactoring forever now. But lately, a couple of areas which I talked about last night, making the new controller more modular so it's easy. The main reason for this is to make Action Mailer more the same as Action Controller so that we don't diverge and lose features in Action Mailer like layouts that we have to port back on later in inconsistent ways. So that's the main reason. But the underlying reality is that now other libraries that want something like a Rails controller with something like Rails callbacks and something like Rails rendering or any combination can pretty easily do that. And you can sort of look at I want my controller to be really fast. What features of Rails controllers are slow, and cherry picking the parts of Rails that work well. So sort of mooting the whole need for a separate notion of metal and just making controllers exactly how fast or slow you need them to be. And the other thing I've been working on with Carl is changing the way template lookup works. So it's easier to drop in another really arcane feature, which is something like templates out of the database. Sounds really arcane, but there are people who are working on things like being able to package up an entire application into one like tar file or something like that, and they want to be able to not have to worry about the vagaries of file system access, and they want to be able to stick things in the database, so making it much easier now to decouple the idea of how templates work from where they come from. Already, Josh did a bunch of work on this front for Rails 2.3, and we just finished it, basically. So.
I've been working a little bit on some of the caching stuff through Active Record. One of the recent things was touching, where basically you want to update the timestamp on an Active Record more or less solely to invalidate its cache key, since we've sort of discovered with memcache that the proper way to do cache exploration is not to do it, and instead rely on unique cache keys. One of the ways of then dealing with sort of a larger composite cache where you have a single cache that's dependent on multiple active records is to use the association hierarchy. So for example, in Basecamp, we have a project model, and a project has many posts. Now, if I have a cache on, say, the dashboard for that given project, if I create a new post, I want that cache to be invalidated. But that doesn't follow normally, because I'm not just going to include all the post messages as part of the key. I want to use the project itself as part of the key. So basically, I want the project model to be able to reflect whether any of its children has changed. So we got that going by saying post belongs to project, and I think, is it just touch true? I even did it like 2 weeks ago and can't even remember.
Yeah, touch true changes updated at, but you can also specify the
right, that's true.
column you want.
Yeah, so if you're just saying touch true, it'll automatically update the timestamp on project when that post changes, or if a new post is being created. And that makes it really simple to have these hierarchies of cache key management. And one of the other things I sort of was working on and off on for a while was designing the new router DSL. We've been doing a bunch of work on sort of the internals of the router that still needs to have an interface. You still need to be able to declare your routes in some ways. And actually during the keynote I was showing just some sketches on some of the stuff we've been working on, but that still needs to be hashed out in its entirety, and that's not done yet. So.
Right, and one thing I forgot to mention was I want to work on inbound email into Action Mailer. It's a complete hack right now, and there's a few sort of nice things we can do with basically routing and some standards around how to keep your message reader thing alive and not die all the time, which will hopefully be useful for some people. It's unfortunately I did a bunch of that work for a client, and it's still technically under NDA, but worst case scenario, I'll tell Rick what to do and he'll implement it. Clean room.
So I'm going to ask my question in the most impish way I can possibly think of, which is, when is Rails going to be faster than MERB? And I have a reason for asking that question, so I'm just...
Really soon?
Soon.
So what's interesting is that if you actually go through and find out how MERB made things fast, a lot of it was caching on the controller class itself, and Rails already had a pretty nice architecture for splitting out responsibilities, but wasn't taking huge advantage of it for optimization purposes. Or it was in a lot of cases, but not in a lot of other cases that MERB was caching stuff. So honestly, the way you make Rails or MERB fast is by reducing a lot of runtime operations to hash lookups. And there's a lot of room to do that in Rails right now, and we know how to do it in MERB, but it was more painful than it should have been in MERB because it was all in one object.
Sure.
And
so one of my other questions is, obviously I've been working with Google App Engine stuff, and is there anything that needs to be done to either Rails or to Ruby and particularly referencing JRuby to make boot up faster for Rails? Because that's actually one of the reasons that, as far as I'm aware, the Google guys picked MERB to demo.
So are there inherent changes that we need to make to Rails to make it run faster on Google App Engine?
Well, the issue
To
with
boot
Google
faster?
Yeah, to boot faster in particular, because the deal is that the JVM, the first request to Google App Engine will take a couple seconds with Rails because they're firing up and spinning up a JVM instance.
Right. Part of me says that's kind of Google's problem, like a regular application. Startup time is 0. It has no bearing on the performance on a given request, but at the same time, we were talking with someone at lunch today whose app takes like 30 seconds to start up. So it would be nice to not be quite that ridiculous in some situations, but a lot of the slowness in Rails startup time is just the things we're requiring and routing. So,
well, there are some things we can't get around just for the sake of thread safety. We eager load all of the models in your application. So there are things we can do in development mode, like lazy loading, just what's needed for that request. But then we're including the loading in the request processing, which means we can't really be doing request processing in other threads. Another big impact on boot up time is generating all the routes code. So there are all these routes helpers, and in development mode, you only need some of them for a request. So you could just select those few. But in production mode, that means that we're generating Ruby code during a request also. So some of this stuff is just unavoidable. We either need to try to make it faster or not do it.
I think there's also like levers we could tweak. So right now, in the case of generating all the URLs, we're sort of paying on purpose startup costs to avoid request costs. It makes sense in some cases to turn the lever in favor of some requests being slower in exchange for faster boot up time.
A lot of that was for safety, though, for thread safety. Like, you essentially can't ever require classes in any way, shape, or form in a thread in Ruby. It will just never work right, and it's an inherent thing.
But you can make methods.
We can make methods, yeah. And so, in cases where it's slow because we have to read all your models, and we're kind of stuffed. But
Sure.
But for the case of, the routing stuff, sure, we can do a much better job in terms of delaying it, or maybe even loading a subset of them, or using method missing to dynamically load them. Like, there'll be fancy stuff we can do there.
All right, cool, thanks.
We do kind of have a unicorn target of being able to run Rails as a CGI effectively. So that means booting up fast.
Yeah, I would also say that it's definitely things like loading all your models are not that slow in Ruby. So there's a lot of other things, like people load their models and then some plugin goes and looks up all the columns in the database. So there's definitely a give and take we have to do. I think it's probably unlikely that somebody's app loads up in 30 seconds because of Rails. I think it's a lot more likely that someone's app loads up in 30 seconds because they have has many polymorphs installed. I know that was an issue for me.
Yeah, and that's a great point, actually. If you look in your config initializers and you look in your vendor plugins and see what all those things are doing on boot up, and often it's a lot of stuff. Like, are you making an S3 connection when the app boots? And a lot of people are, and that's half a second right there.
So we all love Ruby and Rails. That's why we're here. But there's a lot that we can learn from other people. In a world where Ruby or its frameworks didn't exist, what frameworks would you guys be using and why?
Do you want to start, David?
I probably wouldn't be doing web programming. I'm just sort of, even when I was working PHP, I just kind of have that obsessive compulsion to create my own stuff and tailor to that. But that doesn't mean there's plenty of cool web frameworks out there. Django, I think, is pretty awesome for what it does. Seaside is very interesting. So there's a lot of other cool web frameworks out there, but there's just something for me personally that comes from working on it directly that isn't really replaceable.
Yeah, I've pretty much read a book on every web framework that has a book, and they all suck. My speculation is it's Ruby's executable class bodies. It sounds odd, but the fact that you can actually make a method that runs in a class body that does regular Ruby things significantly simplifies the types of abstractions you could write in a framework. And if you look at, I was just reading Lift, which is a new Scala framework, and I guess Scala is taking over, so everyone should use that. The equivalent to Rails whatever is a 10-line Maven command. So you'd say Rails my app. Instead, you have to write 10 lines of Maven. And I asked them, so why did you do this? They're we haven't gotten to fixing it yet. And if you actually just read a Rails book or Django book, there's a lot of stuff like that where it's why did they do that? And you go ask them and they say, we just haven't gotten around to making that prettier yet. And it really adds up, it really matters. And yeah, with executable class bodies have the same effect where now you have to start adding all this cruft in order to annotate in Java. You have to annotate has many because you can't just put a method there, and that just adds up and it's painful. But there's something to be learned from every one of those books, one or two things.
No, I think that's a great point. I actually did the same thing as Yehuda. I got ebooks on pretty much all the major frameworks, and I would read through them, even all of the Java frameworks. And every single time there would be some idea. There would be one or two ideas that's pretty interesting. And I think that's one of the sort of love-hate relationships I've always had with the Java community, is that there was actually a ton of fantastic ideas. They were just trapped under the weight of this platform that wasn't very appealing to me. But that didn't mean that the ideas themselves weren't good. There was tons and tons of great ideas. So actually a really easy way oftentimes to improve Rails was just to look at all of those good ideas and liberate them from Java.
Yeah, I'd like to think that if I was stuck using something else, that there'd be some other framework which was as focused on making sure that that out-of-the-box experience, that first time that you use something or that first time you start an application, is just as smooth as... like, we spent a lot of time on that, and I think people underestimate it. Like you say, the 10-line Maven thing, or clone this and put this here and do this there, and just even Django to an extent, it's like I have to make all of these choices before I can even start. Like, it's great I can make them later, but I can't even start a server yet. And I hope that I'd find something else like that. I'm pretty happy where I am and pretty busy, so I haven't really looked around at web frameworks. In terms of programming languages, I really like the idea of all of these weird concurrency-friendly application languages that run on the JVM, so maybe there'll be a cool web framework coming out of that. I just haven't seen it yet.
I'd just add one thing to that is that people often talk about how Rails is getting more and more complex. When I look back at the work you actually had to, the setup work you had to do on Rails 0.5, the first version, it was way more. Rails used to be much more complex in terms of getting started. The process we have right now of going from Rails, my blog, to doing a script scaffold, post or whatever, and RakeDB, migrate, I think we're pretty much there. You can't make that in fewer steps. And I think that seal on continuously improving that out-of-the-box experience is a huge part of what makes Rails different.
That was 3 steps, though.
It was 3 steps, but all of those are naming your application, naming your model, and then the last one is just basically bootstrapping the system. I don't think those 3 are actionable choices you have to make.
Yeah, in 0.5, you had to do your routing with the mod rewrite. So sometimes.
And you had to paste that Apache config thing into htaccess, and it was kind of ghetto, really.
I'd probably use ASP.NET MVC. I was an old .NET guy. I'd probably be hating life.
I'd probably be chasing the newest Java hotness also. So I mean.
I'd like to hear your perspective on how important you think it is to move legacy Rails apps, like early 1.2 apps up to 2.3 or 1.126, and maybe even projecting out to what happens after 3.
Sure.
Just kind of cost benefit or whether you would undertake
in short,
that.
it's not particularly important. Speaking as someone who's actually done this, and this year I moved an app from 1.2, an earlier release, to 1.2.6 to 2.0 to the latest version there, and it was relatively painful, and the reality was it didn't necessarily give us anything. And we wanted to upgrade so that we could get access to the cookie store, so it was worth it from that perspective. But if it's working and there are no security vulnerabilities that you need to be aware of, and I don't think there are, there's nothing that affects anything that's not like really old, then I wouldn't necessarily move. It can be a painful experience, not too bad, but we could always do better in that regard. I guess this is our last question, by the way, because the clock thing's flashing.
Okay.
Your question is
so
our
I've
last
actually changed the question I was going to ask like 3 times while waiting in line anyway. So will there ever be, given the merger of MERB and a lot of the MERB philosophy and ideas being bought into the Rails, or sort of rolled into Rails now, along with the efforts of the MERB contributors, do you think we will ever see a Rails core sort of gem, which strives to be the sort of minimum set of code that you would need to run something that is a Rails app, but might not need as much as you get in like the current, I mean, Action Pack is its own gem right now, but in the Action Pack distribution, which is, I guess, as sort of as small of a distribution as we have right now. And I ask because I think the idea of Rails being a backbone for the Ruby web ecosystem is a very interesting one, wherein it sort of provides structures and guidance and is a place where people can collaborate and agree on commonalities, and then actually compete on individual components. So I think, in my mind, a Rails core gem, which is very tiny, with a bunch of add-ons on top, even if they are, of course, very easy to get started with, and there is a approved sort of recommended stack that you guys are responsible for maintaining, Do you think that that would happen? What do you think about the trade-offs involved? Obviously, there are pros and cons to that sort of approach, and just kind of be interested in hearing your take on that sort of extreme modularity of the Rails internals itself.
Well, that is already kind of happening. And the question is almost psychological also, how much it matters to have a distribution of just the core parts versus just requiring the file you need. And it is just Ruby. If you want to use the abstract controller, require the abstract controller and start from there.
Yeah, definitely.
Fundamentally, I'm not necessarily sold on breaking up the gems, but I'm definitely sold on there being a possible configuration which is as light as you described. So instead of using the default dispatcher or whatever, you can just require a few things, subclass some things for your rack application, and just get off and running with it.
Right. I think it's probably should be something that we do where we have a file that requires those things. So probably the reason right now why that's not true in master is because you would have to know which files to require to get to that minimal distribution. I think having a file which could be like require Rails core, which is basically just a file that required the things that you would need, is a good idea.
So that's what ends up mattering, the core concept, and I think we're all behind that.
We've been told that we're out of time, however, so thanks for the questions, but I guess we have to call it. One more?
One more.
Okay.
Do it.
Quick one.
Just obey the screen.
This is a very quick question. Is there any chance of making routing and mapping pluggable subsystems?
Yes, Yehuda is working on exactly that, so you should talk to him after this.
Yeah, the basic idea is to make routing more of an API and less of a you have to use the Rails routing, which knows all this stuff.
Great, thank you.
Cool.
All right,
thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. And just thank you all for coming to RailsConf, and that's the end of the show, so have a good trip home. Thanks.